Karlis, thank you so much for joining me on my soapbox today. Today on the soapbox series, we have Karlis Povisils. Did I say that right?
No, Povisils. The accent's on the
Povisils.
first. Yep, long O.
Okay,
Long O accent on the
Povisils
first. Yep.
from Apex Clean Energy, the SVP of Development. Really excited to have Karlis here. We've been working together for the past few months, and we were introduced by now a good friend of mine, Jade Sheely. So welcome to the soapbox.
Thank you, Mindy. Thanks for having me. Really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah. So you've done some really incredible things at Apex. So I thought we would start with that because you have been there and built the team from the ground up to 65 people, which is an incredible feat in and of itself. And then I think what's also worth noting is that you, within this team, have quite a bit of retention, folks on the team, and this is within project development, to be clear, that
Hmm.
have been there for 4, 6, 8 years, which is really unique in the development space from what I've seen working with many developers. So I'd love to speak with you about that journey, however you want to take that, building up the team, retaining the team, and just talk about that.
Sure. So Apex has a long track record of successfully developing, building, and operating projects. Uh, in this last year, we had the really big milestone of the partnership with Ares, which now allows us to own and operate. So now we've always been able to do it at scale, and now we have the added benefit of being able to own it. But back in those early days, I started with the company in 2010, and I was employee 16, I think, and it was definitely a startup. We achieved first revenue in 2012, and that allowed us to ramp up a little bit around then. I was promoted to this position in 2014, and our CEO, Mark Goodwin, uh, his directive to me was, okay, we're no more orphaned projects. We're going to staff up to be able to broaden our portfolio, and that's where we started to ramp up at that point. We had several years of that, and then we were in a steady state position on development staffing from probably 2018 through 2020. And then in 2021, along with just about all of the rest of the industry, the thinking was that this is now the time for renewables to enter into another growth spurt. And the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act this past year was a further loud clanging of the dinner bell. And so that this is where we now are in another growth spurt. And we've been able to hang on to folks, I think, for it's not a rocket science type reason. It's just it's a great group of people. There's a strong culture, and it's a culture that's shared through all the way from up to the executive team, all the way down to every employee. And part of that is there's a few things. One is the leadership culture is very much a servant leadership culture. So I think of my primary responsibility is how do I keep this really excellent team together? And it's about what are the resources that they need, what are the problems that they need help solving, what are things that need to be gotten out of their way. So that's a piece of it. And another piece is it's very much a sleeves rolled up type of company. Nobody is in a corner office somewhere divorced from the work. My office happens to be a corner, but it's a sleeves are rolled up and folks are doing the work. I mean, the analogy I use is sort of like, if you're the head of Ford Motor Company, you still know how to change the oil in a car, I still do land work. I still get involved in project permits. I still go to, public engagement efforts, open houses. I talk to opposition, and it allows me to stay connected to the work and understand what the team is going through. I think the other thing that's kind of unique at Apex is we welcome conversations around careers. We understand that folks have a plan, and if they don't have a plan, they should. And it's not something to be avoided. It's not you get to the end of the year and you're afraid of what folks are going to ask. We're not that afraid because we've been talking about career paths all year. Not all of it's formal. It's more that there's no taboo on it. And so it's you have to be mindful of what the company needs, but you also need to be mindful of what the employees need, what the members of your team need. And if they feel like you're attending to that and they see that you're responding to that, they're more likely to stay.
Mm. Thank you for that background. You know, something that's come up a lot in conversations with my clients recently is how much the landscape has changed for retaining employees in the last couple of years. I think you and I have actually talked about this a little bit too. In the last couple of years, I'll be specific, since 2020. Um, what have been some challenges for you and your team to maintain that retention in the last couple of years with the growth spurt in the industry, with the landscape changing, with working remote, you know, all of these different, with the pandemic? How has that, what
I'll,
challenges have come up for you? Yeah.
I'll try to take a couple bits at a time. So one, that everybody's looking at the same time means that there's a lot of competition for folks with experience.
Mhm.
And we're not, Apex is not immune to that. Luckily, our retention rate is very high. Our attrition rate's very low, but still, that's, you're not going to have really many years where if you have less than 10% attrition, that's great. But on a team as large as ours, that's still 6, 7 people hires a year you need to make, even if you're not accounting for growth. I'd say one thing that we've done, and we've been doing this now for a while, is we recognize that this industry needs to grow. And this is the really positive message for your listeners is this is a great time to get into this industry. We need a lot more people in this industry. So there has to be a way to bring folks in from other careers. There has to be a way to bring college grads in. And so paying attention to those other channels to bring folks in and not have everyone competing for the person with 1 or 2 or 3 years of experience. I think the other bewildering thing has just been and it's a supply and demand issue, is just the massive run up in salaries over the last couple of years, combined with the first time in my lifetime where inflation has been meaningful. In my lifetime, it's always been 1, 2, maybe 3%. And so it's just have to be more intentional about it. It's that these issues aren't going to solve themselves. I don't know how many more little trite sayings I can say there. But I think the main one is just more people need to be in this industry, and so we do need to find ways to grow it, and we do it with primarily two ways. One is recent college graduates, and the other we call them career switchers, and I think every company should be doing that as well, so that we're not all competing over the same really small number of folks that are out there that have experience. I mean, in this industry, if you have 2 or 3 years of experience, you're considered a veteran at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But that person may only be 25 years old. I mean, there's a life experience gap, and that can be challenging too. Like we could talk about that topic for the entire hour.
Yeah. Yeah, we could probably host a second episode about that. You brought up something, the meaningful inflation, and obviously this is something that's really topical right now as the industry is growing. There's also concern of a recession on the horizon. Some believe we already are in a recession. How do you believe that the industry will be impacted by the recession, and then how the talent pool will be impacted by it?
Well, Apex has always been a consistent investor through business cycles, and we've had good luck there. I mean, there were times where I'm trying to think, like most recently was probably 2014, where I think that was a PTC cliff year. 2013, it was not extended, and folks were selling development assets left and right, and Apex was buying a bunch of assets. And I remember at the time thinking, we're either doing something really smart or really risky. And it worked out for us. Our philosophy has always been that the market will reward projects that are ready, and that this industry is going to really blast off, and that's turned out to be true. I think the demand for renewable energy doesn't seem to be completely linked to overall factors in the economy. So we are not looking to ramp down. We're looking to keep investing in the portfolio and do what we've always done, which is invest through the cycles. The cycles are going to come and go, but those assets are, if you don't have them, if you've divested yourself of the development assets, you won't be ready. I mean, as you know, these projects take years to come to fruition. So keeping things in permitting, keeping things in the queue, they're really important. So when you get on the other side of the cycle, you'll be able to survive it. But I think it does make sense. There does sometimes feel like an irrational aspect to the salary run up. And, I'm always careful not to be at the hiring at the peak of the peak of the peak. And I think Apex, with the strength of our culture, we don't need to be the very highest paying. We need to be above average. We need to be very aware of where the market is heading, and we need to follow it to some extent. But we don't need to chase every single offer or piece of market data that we find either.
Hmm. Yeah. I was talking about this with another client yesterday, that there's a lot of danger in inflating salaries too much for obvious reasons, that there's an impact on the entire project life cycle, for one. But there's a future risk to the talent as well if they're uh, inflating their salaries beyond what their worth is, or what the value that they add to the organization is. There's a future risk that you're not going to be worth that anymore one day when the market corrects, because we all know there's going to be a market correction. We just don't know when.
It's a great point, and I think, to add to that point, Mindy, I remember hearing from one of my friends and colleagues, came from Noble Environmental Power. It's a company that doesn't exist anymore, and they got caught up in a inflationary cycle on talent. And some of the folks that were in that company opined later that while it was an incredibly heady thing as a 20-something-year-old to be paid an exorbitant amount of money, it wound up misaligning incentives later. If they felt like they couldn't take less than that, then when future opportunities opened up, they wound up going to places that weren't a good fit, because it was the place that could give them the salary that they wanted, when probably they would have been better off finding the place that's the best fit, even if it meant taking a salary cut.
Hmm.
Having those inflated salaries makes that math a little more difficult for people, and maybe it could lead to them making a just not the best fit decision for their careers later in life.
Absolutely. We've gotten, when, like you said, this market is unprecedented, what we're in right now. I mean, definitely in my career. And I've been in recruitment for 15 years, but I've only worked in renewables for 6. We've gotten away from the important point of the conversation when we're considering a career move, on really why you're making that move, because everybody's become a little bit obsessed with how much money they can get. And that's not necessarily a criticism. It's kind of just an observation of what's happening. It's not one person that's at fault. It's just that when we only talk about money, of course, that's the only thing you're going to think about. But you mentioned earlier something that Apex does, with continuing, at least with the retention piece. The attraction piece is, I think, another part of this conversation. But you mentioned that you really keep an open dialogue around career development, where people want to go, ask that question. I want to talk a little bit more about that, because I know leadership is something, and how you lead is something that you're really passionate about. So I'd like to talk a bit more about that, and how you've created that culture within yourself and the other leaders on your team. Yeah, if you could share more about that.
Sure. I mean, I've been blessed that I've had an opportunity to work with a lot of great leaders, and just supervisors, and I tend to take bits and pieces from each of those experiences. My first experience out of graduate school was working with the New Jersey Office of Legislative Services. And so it's the professional staff of the New Jersey legislature, a lot of academic refugees. And my boss was new to the position, and she had been promoted above folks with more experience. And that's where I first saw the servant leader model. She supported professionals, she supported risk taking, she made sure that folks got the assignments that they wanted, that she was off camera spotting to make sure that folks didn't extend too much, or that if there was a fall, that it wouldn't break someone. But also took care not to be in the lens when the celebrations and things were happening. Like I call it now, like a photo bombing a closing. Like the team has successfully closed the project at Apex. I'm not at the closing dinner. I don't go to the closing dinner. I'm not in those. I might send a note congratulating the team, but I'm not putting myself in that frame. That's not my victory. That's the team's victory. And that selflessness. I've had several great experiences with leaders that all had that. Not that, like, there is something to be said for leading from the front, but that dramatic drawing the sword and follow me, everybody. And it's like a very dramatic, that's a little bit all about the leader, rather than, that there's something to be said for a kind of calm, measured approach. There's a lot of things going on at any given moment. And just having that ability to, my wife would say, I'm not the greatest listener, but you have to learn how to do that here, because you need to understand what the issues really are and solve the right things. And you probably don't know all the answers. And if you go into the room and you start claiming to profess to know everything that's going wrong and solving it, the team is probably going to get quiet and let you fill that space. And then you're missing out on a lot of great input from some really smart folks.
I really like that. So basically, you're letting your team's success really be theirs. So they own that. They feel the pride from their, from what they've done. And then it's not, you don't get the praise for it as the leader.
Yep.
They do.
That's it.
I really like that.
Something
else,
because you get proud of the team. You get proud of what you're doing. You get proud of the team. And there's a little bit where you're advocating for the team, and it starts to look like you're also you're championing yourself too. So you just have to be aware for it and be like, it's just it's just such an amazing thing to see your colleagues thriving, and you want to try to set up as many opportunities for that to happen, not just within the development team, but for the company as a whole. Just never get tired of seeing those stories, and there's lots of wins along the way that we need to take the time to celebrate those too. It's not just about the project closing. If you're only celebrating project closings, you're putting too much value on one part of the process. And there are a lot of folks that are working on the front end of the project. So you're like, where is the project going to be? All that site control work, the building the support over years, potentially managing the interconnection process, all those different studies, that there's a different set of folks that it's at the very, very end. And you need to celebrate those victories all along the way, because it can take years to get there. And you could also go years and the project doesn't happen. And so you got to celebrate those victories where you find them. It's a hard job. It's the part of what makes it worthwhile is if you've got the right folks in the foxhole with you. And then you've got to be focused on the end goal, but you do need to also be aware that there's a lot of milestones along the way that are all of which are worthy of celebrating.
Yeah, I can relate a lot to that. Different, our life cycle is different, and we're sales instead of project, but that's the evolution of a leader, right? Is being able to step out of that individual contributor position where you get a lot of recognition for being great. And, there's a lot of dopamine hits that you get from that, and love, being at the top of the leaderboard or whatever the case may be. I'm speaking for myself here, because I've always thrived on that. But then over the course of the last couple of years, for me personally as a leader, it's how can I be okay with not being number one? But then the evolution is, but my team is number one, or I want to get my team or people on my team to that level because of, passing on the knowledge that I've gained and developed over time. And you're right, there is a lot of reward in that, but it's tough to step back. And I don't think we're taught that as leaders, how to step back and let others be in the limelight.
And it's you're hitting it right on the head. It's very hard to me. I love project work, and so I think I think there's some folks that look to get promoted because they want to get out of the work. I want to get promoted to a position where I don't have to do that work anymore.
Mhm.
And like the leaders here, and speaking at least for myself personally, that's not the case. I tell what I say is I want to stay close to the work because I want to understand what it is so that I can know how best to support the team. And that some of that means having to do the actual nuts and bolts of development work. But it's a balance. I mean, I get told sometimes by some folks on my team, you're getting too into it. You're going a little bit too far into the weeds on this one. We really need you back at headquarters because, like this, and this are all, going sideways, and we need you to help us get that part solved, and I a lot of times liken my job to it. It's one part. You've got a crowbar, you've got an oil can, like you're unsticking the stuff that's jamming up. Sometimes it's a mop bucket. Sometimes it's clean up on aisle 5. I mean, there's a very unglamorous part to it that I think if you as a leader, if you can embrace that part, to use a sports analogy, like the blocking and tackling, like the unheralded stuff, that you gain credit with your team, because they see that you're not out there showboating. But it's hard.
Mhm.
I love project level problem solving. And
Mhm.
there's sometimes where somebody on the team is telling me about a problem and I immediately go into problem solving mode. They're not there because they want me to solve the problem. They're just telling me from my own awareness, this is the problem. And we've already got a solution that we're working on. So thank you very much. Don't need your input on the solution of the problem. But
Mhm.
it's hard to stay away when that's what you came up with. And if you really like the work as I do, then you're always looking for that way to dive in.
Yeah, it's hard to cede that control because you have to be able to trust your team to do it as well, or God forbid, better than you at some point. But I totally agree that being in the weeds, being in the transaction builds so much credibility as a leader because it shows like, hey,
Mhm.
I don't have too much ego to do this work myself.
Yep.
Nobody is better than this work, for one. And two, you're leading by example that this is how we can do things. This is how we should do things. And then your team can start to emulate or follow in your footsteps. And that I think the player coach leader, that's always the type of leader that I've been because I struggle to understand things when people just tell me them. I need to be very experiential, so I like to be doing it myself. Um, but you're right, there are a lot of leaders that are, I don't want to do this work anymore, I want to delegate.
Yep.
And I guess maybe it works in some
There's
cases.
things you can, I mean, I listen for some of that in interviews. So if I'm interviewing somebody that's more experienced and I'm asking them about their experience in site control, talking to landowners, building support, and they say things like, if they say the word thought leadership, it's an automatic no. Like that, thought leadership, or talk about like, well, I'm more of a strategic focus person. Like that's all code for I don't work. And so I don't work, but I sure would love to have a job. And that is an
Mhm.
immediate, that's like a giant X, you're looking out for that. But we also as leaders, it's elevating other leaders. It's getting ourselves out of more things, and it's not to avoid the work. It's more to give people room to succeed. I've managed to, my calendar's not clear, but I've got chunks of availability on my calendar so that when something comes up, I am available.
Mhm.
When somebody on my leadership team needs something, they can reach me. I'm either going to pick up the phone or I'm going to call them back within 15 minutes. I'm very rarely making anybody wait longer than that. Uh, but it took some work to do that. I had to come to grips with the reality that the me not being on that project call is completely fine. That the team has got it, and also just the trust that if they don't have it, they're gonna let me know that I've got trust in the team that if they need me, they will call on me. That I don't need to be looking over folks' shoulders at all times. And folks like that level of autonomy. And we're not a flat organization, so we've got, we have team leads that each manage 8 to 10 people, and that core group, we've been together for a really long time. I mean, some of us have been working together for 8 or 9 years, and even the folks that have only been here for a few years doing it, they were doing a similar role for a few years in another company.
That's
And
really
it's
impressive.
elevating that leader. That's part of how you can retain folks, is when they feel empowered and they feel elevated as a leader, and you're stepping aside and letting them do that.
It's a delicate balance. And it sounds like probably over the course of that time, the message has changed and you've built more trust and credibility on that leadership team that, you can step away, or rather empower the team to make decisions on their own and trust that
Mhm.
they'll come to you. But that's hard. It's hard to get to that place when you're building a team, because you take for granted that you need to communicate that up front. Like in the beginning, I need you to engage me on these problems. Don't try and figure it out on yourself the first go around or the second go around. Let's work together so I can support you during this growth and development phase that you're going through, because otherwise they might just try and do it on their own.
Well, yeah, I think there's an important nuance there. That it's the part of how it works is that we Apex is not. And this, I remember Mark Goodwin telling me this once. He's the CEO of Apex. I had really messed up bad on a project. This was in 2014. I still remember it. And something went really wrong. It was my fault that it went wrong. And I was reporting directly to Mark at the time, and I told him, this is what happened, and this is what we're doing about it. This is what the solution looks like. This is what the impact could be. And he said, all right, well, that's bad. But he also said, look, I understand the impossible level of work that everybody's doing, and so that I also understand that means that things are going to happen. And the good news is that we're not a flogging culture. Like, we're not this whole, like, yeah, we're going to need to find out what happened, and folks will be held accountable. But it's nobody's being put in a stockade and having tomatoes thrown at them, and that really stuck with me. So there'll be times where I see something that went wrong, and my first inside I'm thinking, like, oh, I can't believe we're making this mistake again. But then it's all right. But this is the situation we're in, and how do we solve that problem? The thing that Mark singled out, and he wound up in a company meeting telling the story and saying, that's the right way to mess up at Apex. Like, something goes wrong, that the instinct is you're escalating, you are bringing it to the surface. You're not, because sometimes the natural inclination can be, I can fix this. I'm going to fix this before anyone finds out. It's my problem. I caused this. I'm going to fix it. And nobody needs to know about it. Or I don't need to bother anybody about this. That is the wrong impulse. The right impulse is, escalate it. We're all working a million miles an hour. Things are going to happen. You've got to escalate it so that we can figure out how to solve the problem.
Mm.
Take 5 seconds to gather your information and escalate. Don't wait for perfect information. And that then helps. If folks have a lot of confidence that they're not going to be flogged for every little thing that goes wrong, then they're more likely to bring things up, especially if it's something a mistake that they made. And that goes against most human wiring. Most
Mm-hmm.
of it is, I broke this, I'm going to fix it before anybody finds out.
Mm-hmm.
Natural. There's nothing like underhanded about it, but that's in our world, that is not what we want. We want folks to raise it, and then let's
Yes.
solve it together.
Yeah. Failure is not a problem, but how you respond to it could be.
Yep. That's a much more succinct way of saying it than I said, but yes, that's it. That's it exactly. Yep.
So on the same topic of leadership, because obviously you've gone through your own evolution as a leaner, I'm sorry, as a leader, what are some important lessons that you've learned as you've grown as a leader?
Patience. I mean, my family probably would be shocked to see me at work, because I'm not a patient person by nature, but you need to be
Mm.
patient. And I think part of that patience is not suppressing the urge to jump right into we have this idea that leaning in is a good thing. And in a lot of cases it is, but if let's say somebody's bringing a project level problem, or there's a personnel issue, it's let somebody explain it first, and maybe just ask a question or two. Half the time somebody's going to they'll solve it on their own. I mean, I don't have all the answers, and knowing that I somebody's bringing me something, I find myself asking probing questions, not because I've got like a degree in psychology and I'm trying to do some kind of Jedi mind thing on it. It's really, I don't know enough. And so I'm trying to understand a little bit more about the broader situation. And in the process, more often than not, the person that's coming to me, they're coming up with a solution and solving it in real time with almost no input from me.
Mhm.
And being comfortable with that. So I think new leaders, the other thing I think that new leaders, a problem that folks make, the trap you run into, is thinking that you've got to do it all yourself. That busyness and touching everything is something that you need to do. It's not. I was coaching a newer leader recently on our team, and he was really stressed out that somebody was going on vacation. And well, I don't know. I've got to know everything that person was doing. And we're like, no, you don't. They don't expect you to be a perfect substitute for the person who's temporarily out. It's more just you're covering while they're away, and you need to know some basic amount. But no one expects you to know everything that person knows. Um, Sometimes folks feel like they've got to know enough so that when somebody, their superior, in like my case, it'd be the C-suite, if they ask me a question, there's a lot of stuff that I'm only about, 2 or 3 questions deep on most projects. There's a few things that I'm more actively involved in, and it's being comfortable to say, to your boss, like, let me check with the team on that, because they're the ones working on it, and it's nobody's saying what you don't know that yourself. I think there's a big fear that you're going to be revealed to not know something, and it's just not a real fear in most places. It's certainly not a big fear at Apex.
Yeah. So patience, but then I also heard, and you didn't use these words, but what I heard you also say was like, be curious about, what's going on by asking questions rather than, yeah.
Yeah, like that. I mean, I think that's probably part of being a good listener. And I am not a great listener. I really have to struggle with it. I've got the sticky notes that are reminding me to listen more and talk less. But and asking questions is a way that I can listen without just sitting in silence, because sometimes you need to prompt it along a little bit.
Yeah, right. You need certain pieces of information in order to then lead.
Yeah.
And the other thing I heard you say was be compassionate. I think, again, I don't know if it's like a human nature thing, but we have this expectation of ourselves for perfection.
Mm.
And as a leader, I think it's really easy. We do the same thing, but then when you watch other people go through the learning and development stages, you see, the failure like we talked about, or, that word has such negative connotations, but, you
Mm.
see the struggles or what have you, um, and the expectation to be perfect throughout the process. So as a leader, you have to be able to hold space for people to make mistakes and then tell them, hey, I'm not expecting you to know everything right now. Like, it's okay that this happened.
And there's often, folks have things going on in their lives too that we often don't know about. I mean, sometimes it's like hidden talents that we don't know that our colleagues have, and those are fun to hear about. But there could also be, they could be caring for a sick relative. They could be going through, them or their partner could be going through a cancer, a cancer battle, or somebody could be in the grips of addiction. I mean, you just don't only see a part of their lives, and it's it's part of that, like, oh, I know what's going on here. What's going on here is, this ball got dropped and this is the solution. Like, part of that fallibility is just knowing, like, you don't have all the answers, and you don't have all the information, not even remotely close to all the information. And it's new age. I do think that, like, assuming positive intent is something that we don't do enough of across the board. And rather than jumping to the conclusion that has somebody is in a sinister way doing X, Y, and Z. It's, well, there could be any number of reasons why this particular issue has happened. And let's just listen for a minute and ask some questions and just try to figure out what's really going on before we jump to conclusions.
Yeah. So really being able to come to work with your whole self and expect that your team may or may not be coming to work with their whole self, but again, create space that they can. I appreciate that. I've talked with other, I think that's a maturity thing too, because when we're young in our careers, we're afraid to come to work with our whole selves. I think we were trained not to. We were
Yeah,
told not to. And then as you get older, it's like, actually, I really need you to, because then I know like how to better communicate with you or how to better manage you. You know, and it doesn't mean you have to tell me everything, but at least
right.
like enough that I can be compassionate.
At least being aware that there's layers there that you may not be oh, alive to. I,
Yeah.
you know, I think a lot of this kind of boils down to like emotional intelligence.
Mhm.
And I think in development, especially, you need to have emotional intelligence to do this job. We're often in very highly charged situations in the field. Uh, there's enough of that going on in the field, and like the folks in their emotions are running high. These are big changes happening in rural communities, and it's tempting to just draw the caricature and say, well, this is what it's like in this place. And it's just having the grace and the emotional intelligence to be able to talk to folks from all walks of life. And that goes also internally. I mean, if you as a leader are hot-headed and like overly judgmental, who's going to come in and tell you the stuff that's going on? That you're creating a barrier for folks to come and tell you what they're going through, or the challenges on things. They're going to go to someone else. And
Mhm.
that's just it's not healthy to create a situation where folks don't they feel like they can't deliver you bad news or challenging news or tell you about problems. You want folks to do that, and you want the leaders that you're elevating to also have that. uh, Everybody's going to have their own style, but you do want certain things, like respect for others, empathy, emotional intelligence, curiosity. You want some things to be a little bit more universal.
Yeah, I think what we're really talking about here is psychological safety. Um,
Yep.
yeah, having an environment where people aren't afraid to make mistakes and tell you, hey, I messed something up. Can you help me? And it's not easy to do that. I think we learned that the hard way.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we wind up being a little too hard on ourselves. And then since we're hard on ourselves, then the temptation is to be hard on others as well.
I was talking to Aaron Branham, who's the VP of Development and Construction for Revon. We had a similar conversation around leadership in that there's not as much training and development opportunities or resources. And yeah, if you have a high EQ,
Hmm.
maybe you can better, you faster can adapt. But generally, kind of what I was talking about earlier, we're all just really good at what we do. And then we get put into leadership roles. And then it's kind of like, all right, good luck. Now you've got a team of 5 or
Yeah,
65.
you're right. I mean, you know, many developers are generalists. You see a few engineers and other types, but most folks are generalists, even if they're lawyers, engineers, they may have some specific technical training, but the development role is primarily one of a mix of project management and frankly sales. It's a communications, because it's a lot of different negotiations and being able to do more like public engagement communications, but there's also a heavy persuasion aspect. You're At the end of the day, you are trying to persuade a local community that they ought to approve a permit for you to be able to build. And in places where there's not a permit, you're trying to persuade a group of landowners to allow this project to go forward. And we don't have eminent domain, and we don't have limitless resources to throw at it. And that, I think it's tempting to say that generalists have some of that, and especially in development, because EQ is so necessary to do the job well, that you have a leg up if you're moving into a leadership role, because you've already had to, if you're successful, you've already had to figure out some of these things, and then maybe that's a transferable skill into leadership as well.
Yeah, that's fair. Like you've kind of been training for it throughout
A little
your
bit,
whole
but I mean,
career.
we've started to, we over the summer we were looking at, we sometimes you have to make space. As a quick aside, you have to make space for non-project conversations. We live and die by projects, but sometimes we have to look at the tools and look at how we're organized and what are we prioritizing. And we were looking at things like, we make use of surveys a lot to try to get things in the team, and try to say, like, are we micromanaging? Are we going too heavy, too light? Training, mentoring, and team will tell you. You ask them, they'll tell you. And that's we were looking at training and engagement and a lot of those things, and that was definitely an area that the team was asking that we do more of. That got onboarding, and then there's training that's available for folks that have been here 3, 4, 5, 6 years, but it was conversations about like feeling overwhelmed versus feeling overworked, and that nuanced difference between those two things. And so, okay, travel is very stressful, but maybe time management is a part of that. Like there's things that we're so much of it we're just learning on the job, but maybe there are some formal trainings that can be helpful here. Like we can't quit our jobs and just train all day, but
Right.
I'm sure Apex is similar to a lot of companies that we're growing quickly, that the one-on-one mentoring, which is so important, it's not enough. There just isn't enough time for it to go as long as you would want it to. And so what are the other things you can supplement that with to be able to fill these holes? And this is, again, back to listening to the team, listening to the employees. If they're saying, hey, I don't feel like I know enough about how to do my job, it's not communicated clearly enough about what this means. I think a lot of us old timers, we have the war stories of like, yep, I first got in the wind. There was we acquired and you could go on forever, like acquired a distressed asset, all the leases had expired, and I'm out there, and this is 3 or 4 years later, and everyone's saying this project's dead. What are you doing? And I'm showing up and realizing I look like a Bible salesman, like I'm just going on and just figuring it out on my own through trial and error. And when the industry was really, really small in the early days, you had to do it that way, like, because you didn't have a team that was large, and you didn't have the support, and you were doing all your own everything. Now most teams have subject matter experts. So we have somebody that knows about transmission and knows about, that's an environmental biologist, and legal support, and it's not all like on the phone with tech support in those early days. And it's like, we don't need it to be like those. It can't be like those early days. And there's more efficient ways for folks to get up the learning curve. And they're not bashful about demanding it. By willing to have these conversations, you're inviting that feedback, rather than, the alternative is somebody gets frustrated and then they leave. Mm-hmm. Or they come to you and say, oh, I've got this other offer. And now you're just in this more awkward position where, if you're attending to all these things as you go, you're maybe hitting some of that off, because job satisfaction is higher. Mm-hmm. And it's not necessarily just about comp, although you need to really be paying attention to that market as well. And you need to be responsive. It can't just be tough. We did something 3 years ago. Live with.
Yeah, you probably find yourself saying or thinking, back in my day, this is how we did this, or, did you end up finding any resources? Did you use like third-party resources for that training, or what did you find?
It's a combination of things. I think we are in the middle of kind of revamping training as we speak. We've got some stuff where we have a platform, and we're getting better at, when somebody's going to give a talk, record it. record it,
Mhm.
have it be a narrated presentation rather than, but somebody just kind of getting up in front of a group and ham and egging it and just winging it, because that's not going to be as useful to a watcher. That's one of those, you had to be there. And so being mindful that when somebody with a ton of experience is speaking on a specific topic, let's make sure that that's captured. Uh, but we're now kind of going through the inventory of what needs to be captured. Like it's the title process. They are like things that come up at different points in the process. We're realizing that more formal training on site control. It's not enough like to have a ride along. We need to be more organized. Hiring and training people in cohorts so that they have networks. That's another problem that we're, challenge that we're facing is with a lot of rapid growth during COVID. And that was part of your 6 questions ago that I didn't answer is, there's a lot of folks that get hired that they may have come to Charlottesville for the first time last week for our Christmas party. And, that's connection. Like one of the things we're hearing from the team all the time is that more connection, more engagement is good.
Mm-hmm. I
Don't
bet.
worry about micromanaging. That is not happening. Far from it. It's like more engagement, and doesn't necessarily have to be with engagement with your direct superior. And, that people want to talk to peers. They want to talk to folks outside of the department. So we're starting to jumpstart those networks, because with more people working remotely, we do have a lot of folks in Charlottesville that come to the office, but there's a lot of folks that work remotely. And, how do you help them start with a network? Not that they're wedded to that forever, but get them started that they can have conversations that don't necessarily involve their direct supervisor. Because there's things that you don't want to maybe ask your direct supervisor, because it's like, this seems like a dumb question.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, how do you do, you're able to turn to the person in the next office, or
Mm-hmm.
you've got somebody that you trust that you can ask really dumb questions. Because I think there are dumb questions, quite frankly. I tell my
Well,
kids that all the time. People will
it's
tell you there's no such thing as a stupid question. They're wrong. There are, but you still need to sometimes ask those questions, and you need to be able to ask them
I
and
like
have
to
them.
think of it as you should know your audience.
Yes.
There's certain questions that are better for different people. And,
Even recently, I remember about to ask my boss, who's the chief operating officer, a question. I thought, I shouldn't be asking Ken this question. Let me ask one of my colleagues in another department, because no, as you said, know your audience.
Mhm. Well, Karlis, I am certain we could talk forever. I feel like we just had, and at least I just had like a mentorship session with you. This is a really, really valuable, like I've taken a lot of notes myself. I've gotten some really good feedback from you, because obviously leadership is something that's really near and dear to you and something that you've been developing and honing your own skills there the last few years with Apex. So I really appreciate you talking through your experience and what you've been doing with Apex. I think a lot of people will find it really valuable because I definitely did.
I appreciate that. I love talking about these issues. I think, the human and employee side of it is not talked about enough.
Hmm.
It's considered, like a soft area. It's so important. And I think especially in this kind of inflationary environment where you got to hold a team together, you ignore this stuff at your peril.
Yeah.
I really
Yeah.
appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. I will say I'm pleasantly surprised that I wound up getting through this without telling any like war stories, or, back in my day, developer stories almost once, but it takes a lot of discipline to do
Maybe for
that.
our next episode,
Yeah.
because I'm sure they're good.
Anytime. Anytime. Well, I mean, every developer has a ton of them, and so like the challenge is you need to tell a story, then listen for their story, then tell a story, then listen for their story, and the temptation is to just go into storytelling mode and not give the other person a chance to tell their stories.
Yeah. I'm finding so many parallels like the more and more we talk. And it's funny because I've worked on project developer positions for 6 years, but I've never until this conversation drawn as many um, similarities between working in recruitment and working in as like in
Mhm.
especially in like a leadership role in recruitment and working in development, because probably because it's so people heavy. Maybe that's what it is, because so much of what you're doing is just navigating egos and personalities and politics. And
Well, I think it's both your industry and ours. It's we don't have patents or technology or anything. It's a platform, and the platform is the people. So it's not like we've got some kind of patent and that's we're going to make money off that patent. We're doing
hmm
R&D and it's going to lead to some invention.
hmm
It's we're both in industries where you have to innovate with how you do things, but we don't have any of those protections. And so it's and even development assets, they don't sit on the shelf well. It's they have whatever value that we put into them, and
mm
then they get built, and then they have some lasting value. But it's when the value is in the platform, that's the people.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that perspective. I've never thought of it that way, and I've learned a lot today, like I said. So thank you.
And likewise, Mindy, always a pleasure.
Well, I'll keep the recording going in case we have any other like tidbits that we want to tie back in. But is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that I didn't prompt?
Um, you know, I think if there was, and I didn't find a way to work, it's like you did a thing that's like the most dangerous for somebody like me, which is ask a lot of really good open-ended questions. So it's like, and there was a lot of choices that had to
Yeah.
be made in the moment. So I felt like so often I was only answering a part of the question, or I was in the middle of the answer. I was violating everything that like our like corporate communications guy said, which is end a sentence. Like, don't be afraid to end a sentence. And I found like, man, I'm really going on with these like super long answers to so many things. And then I'm wondering, like, did I answer everything? Like, well, she's kind of giving me these choose your own adventure questions. And so, but I didn't find a way to steer to, on the DEI front. I think the big insight there is, and for me personally, is, it's the energy industry is very white and male. I mean, there's no way to get around that, but you can do something about it. And it starts with you've got to make sure that your candidate pools. You've got to if you're not looking at DEI resumes, if resumes aren't being put in front of you, then you can't interview those candidates and you can't hire them.
hmm
And so the thing that I noticed was for the longest time, like we were not getting the candidates. And I knew it wasn't because they weren't there. It was because we just weren't finding them.
hmm
And in the last 6 months, it's been, we really have finally, like a lot of the efforts we've made to recruit and try to get, because it's not enough to say, look, once somebody's on the team, there's different ways for folks to be able to climb the ladder, but you've got to find ways. We all do. We all need to find ways to get people on the ladder in the first place. And that's like, it's not just entry level positions. It's like looking for these career switchers. And then since we're in an inflationary environment where we need more people in this industry, it opens the door for folks to come that don't have direct experience in energy.
Yeah.
I remember when I was in business school in 2008, and I remember somebody coming back from an internship and saying, "You do not need experience in energy to get into this field." And that was that. I said, "All right, I'm gonna look into this." And
hmm
I like week one of business school, by week two I had eliminated all of their options, and I was only looking at energy.
hmm
And it's like you can come at this from so many different walks of life, and it creates opportunities for us to do better on these things. But it starts with the candidate pools. You've got to do better, and you can control what your candidate pools look like.
Yeah. Well, we have, we talked about this earlier that we have a supply and demand issue in the industry. Obviously, the demand for talent is much greater than the supply. That's a problem because we need, and I'm speaking we as if, I know I support the industry, but still, the industry needs more talent and especially needs people who know what they're doing
Mhm.
because the projects are so complex. To I don't know if you call it negotiate a tax abatement or do a tax abatement, whatever, you can't just bring in a recent college grad that's never done it before. You need someone who's done that before. And if you have more projects than you have hands to put on those projects, how do you upskill someone fast enough to do something like that? So that is a challenge I don't think we've figured out a solution for, but you're right, there is an opportunity to bring in people from different industries or recent college grads and create a more diverse pool at that entry level so that in the future we have more diverse candidates so you don't feel like
Yeah.
the only way to find them is if you only look for diverse candidates.
That's right. You could really strip development down to, if you want to make sure that you're casting as wide as possible, it's people that know how to get shit done.
Mm-hmm.
Can you get stuff done? Can you work in complex environments? Are you comfortable making decisions with imperfect information? Are you able to deal with folks from all walks of life? Are you able to work? Are you able to keep your calm under pressure? These are things that people in all kinds of industries have, these sorts of skills. And the energy part, we can train them up on that.
Mm-hmm.
And we can bring folks up the learning curve fairly quickly. I think we've barely scratched the surface on, there's a whole group of folks that are seeing the writing on the wall in oil and gas and saying, and I'm ready to, I'm working for a typewriter company. Like I'm working in like in a buggy whip factory. Like I'm in something that's clearly not the future. And, do I want to get out of it 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or do I look to make that transition now?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of experience there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've barely started tapping it.
Yeah.
I think those career switchers, it's tough. I think the washout rate on career switchers is somewhat high because it's a high pressure job. And some folks, I've even had some folks from sales say, this isn't for me. And what they realize is, I like the leaderboard. I want the leaderboard. I want the not instant gratification, but like, I want to know each month that I make it.
Yeah.
And development, you can sometimes go years and you don't know if you're going to succeed. And you could fail for a reason that's got nothing to do with you. You could have done everything right, and you get this exogenous force that's factor that knocks your project out. The queue process change, you get a bad result on something, and that's not for everyone. It's not for everyone. Travel's also not for everyone, and the dealing with opposition is not for everyone.
Yeah, I could imagine that being, some people like a little bit more like transactional work. And while there is a transactive nature in development, it's such a long cycle. And so the highs are probably much higher and the lows are much lower. Whereas in sales, once you figure out what you're doing, you can kind of predict it a little bit more. And it becomes, and you're right, it's addictive.
Yep.
I think salespeople are 100% addicted to that hit you get when you close a deal, even if it's a longer sales cycle. I mean, especially because usually it's a bigger deal.
Closing a project's a gigantic deal, but in development, the first 90% of development, it looks completely different than the last 10%. That first 90, and it's not an exact percentage, but I mean, it's you're really focused on a handful of things. You're focused on, do I have the land? Does the resource there? Am I in the interconnection process? Does it look like I've got a path on my permit? And that last, so you're talking, maybe it's like 10 things that you're focused on, and you start to get close to a closing, that blows up to several dozen things or 200 things that can sink your project. And you shouldn't be thinking about any of those things in that first 90%. You should be generally aware that eventually you're going to have to do that stuff. And so it's why it's always helpful to go through at least one closing. But I think we've said in our team, it's completely legit to say that you'd rather be the person that's taking a project to the point of viability, and then maybe the closing, and it seems sacrilege to say it, but like, maybe you're not the closer. And this idea of like the closer, what if you're the person that's bringing these things from an idea to the point that they're worth a lot of money, and someone else is finishing it. And that's okay when you have a team that's large enough like ours, that there is ability to specialize. I think a lot of us old dogs, we're all old school generalists, and it's okay if not everyone wants to be a generalist. There is some ability to choose your own adventure here. And I think teams and leaders that are alive to that and are willing to consider that are going to have a better chance of retaining people than somebody says, I've got a checklist of 10 things, and if you don't do all these 10 things, you're out. Or that the job has to be this way. Like, there can be a back and forth, especially as you're growing.
Yeah, people don't like to be fit into boxes.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. This was super fun. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mindy. Thanks for thinking of me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you got it. All right, have a good day.